All your life, you've been hearing people talk about keeping it real. You didn't really know what that meant. You said, what does it mean when he says, I'm keeping it real? Well, here's the answer. Real means that we're adjusting for inflation, that we're taking prices out of things. So when a rap guy goes, hey, I'm just keeping it real, that means he's taking the prices out of what he's doing and he's just looking at the values of things without the prices attached to them. Yeah. Okay. Real GDP. So the GDP we've been talking about is technically called nominal GDP. So we take a car, we multiply it times its price, right? So, Porsche sold 1,000 911s at $70,000 a piece. That's $70 million worth of 911s. Okay? That's nominal GDP. Today's output times today's price. All right? That's misleading. Let's suppose that this year Porsche sold 1,000 911s at $70,000 a piece. Okay? Let's suppose that last year they sold 1,200 911s at $5,000 a piece, or at $50,000 a piece. So the price of the car went from $50,000 to $70,000. And instead of selling 1,200, they sold 1,000. 1,000 at $70,000 is $70 million. 1,200 at $50,000 a piece is only $60 million. So GDP went up. Let me say that again. Last year we made 1,200 cars. This year we only made 1,000 cars. Production went down. GDP is supposed to measure production. Okay? But it didn't. GDP went up because the price went up more than the amount of production went down. So even though we were making fewer cars, GDP went up. That's wrong. It's misleading. We don't want to say that. So what we do is we pick a year that we call the base year. Okay? And instead of taking output times today's price, we take that car and we multiply it times the base price. Okay? So if instead of saying 1,200 cars at 50,000 and 1,000 cars at 70, we would say 1,200 cars at 50,000, and next year it's 1,000 cars at 50,000. Now GDP goes down from 60 million to 50 million, and now that's a true story of what happened, that we're producing less. Okay? Half of the next chapter is about this idea of adjusting things by this base price idea. Okay? So, nominal GDP is today's output times today's price. Real GDP is today's output times a base price. Now, we actually don't quite do that because in the modern system we do something called chain weighting. And that means that we kind of balance it out over time. All right? Over time, we change what we buy. And the fact that we change what we buy means that to use, a 5-year-old price on something that comes out today might really not be a good price. So we chain it. We go these 2 years, and then the next year we're comparing this year to the average of those 2 years, and this year to the... And I'm not going to go into the details. You can read it in your book. It's not important that you know the details. In fact, your book doesn't go into it in any great depth. But the idea is they recognize that using the 1980 price and comparing it to the 2020 thing is probably not a good idea. That's what they used to do. And now they adjust the system over time so that there's less effect. Still effect, but less effect. Okay? We also can calculate something called the GDP deflator, which is nominal GDP divided by real GDP. We normally, most of the time when people think about this, they think about it the other way. In other words, if you look at the math here, if you take nominal GDP and divide it by the deflator, you get real GDP. And that's kind of the way most people think about it. But the ratio of nominal GDP to real GDP is what's called the GDP deflator. And that's how much prices have gone up. So if you want to know how much prices have gone up on everything in the world, right? What's going on? Then you can take nominal GDP divided by real GDP and get this price deflator. Don't do that, but you could. All right, so here's a picture. Here's why this matters. So this blue line on here, and this is from something called FRED, the Federal Reserve Economic Database. All right, FRED. FRED is one of your best friends. As an econ major, you love FRED. You use FRED all the time. Fred lives in St. Louis at the Federal Reserve in St. Louis. You can see that over time, this is nominal GDP, right? Over time, it goes up. And the bars that are coming down through this graph, there's bars, right? And I don't mean, someplace where you're drinking. There's bars coming down through this graph. Bars. Okay? Bars. Yeah, bars. Each one of those bars is when a recession happened. So there's a bar at 1970, a bar around 1975, bar around 1980, a bar maybe 82, a bar 91, a bar 2001, 2, a bar 2008, 2009. Okay? You notice that sometimes in those bars, GDP keeps going up. It's a recession. We're producing less. So every one of those bars that comes down through the graph is a period of time where production is going down. GDP should go down. But if you notice in 70, 74, 80, GDP really doesn't go down when we know that production is going down. The only one of these where GDP slows down, but there's only 2 times on this graph where GDP, nominal GDP, actually goes down, and that's the huge crash from 2008 and 2009, and the huge crash, the coronavirus crash, way up at the top. Okay? A lot of times, nominal GDP just cruises right through the recession and keeps going up, even though production is going down. And again, how do we deal with that? We deal with that through real GDP. You can see that real GDP, which is where we have a base year and we don't let prices change, right? Real means we took that price change out. So prices aren't changing on us here. And you can see that in every single one of these recessions now, real GDP goes down. Doesn't go down much in the 2001 recession, but you can see that real GDP is going down every single recession. That's what's supposed to happen, because during a recession we're producing less. Okay? We're excited by that. I think we're excited by that. This is the change in this. So instead of saying, hey, we went from 6,000 to 6,200, we say, oh, we went up by 200. Instead of saying we went from 6,200 and we had a recession, we went to 6,100, we say we went down by, okay? So this is just the up and down part. If you look at this, what do you see? What you see, if we look at the left-hand side, is the 1950s, then the 1960s, and 1970s, and the recessions are still on here. The economy grew. When it was growing, it grew a lot faster in the 50s and 60s and 70s than it grows today. Does it not? There are times when that graph is over 15% growth, right? And a lot of times it's between 5 and 10. Yes? Much of the time it's between 5 and 10. Since 1980, GDP hasn't been over 7, right? It hasn't grown faster than 7, really. And most of the time it's growing 3 or 4, right? And the last 5 years, It's growing 2.5. It hasn't hardly grown at all the last 5 years. Okay. But on the other hand, and economists are really famous for saying, on the other hand, it's one of our pet sayings. If we look at the 50s and 60s and 70s through 1980, so we'll go up through 82. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. There's 8 recessions. Yes, 8 recessions from 1947 when this starts through 1983. There's 8 recessions. So that's the 50s, the 60s, the 70s, plus 6 years. That's 36 years. There's 7 recessions. 8 recessions, sorry, in 36 years. Since 1983, in the 36 years since, we've had 3. Right now we're in 4. So we've had 4. So half as many recessions. Okay? This period from 1980s on is called the Great Moderation. GDP grows more slowly. It turns out there's a lot less inflation and there's a lot fewer recessions. So everything is just kind of moderate. It's like we've been meditating for 35 years. Okay? Before that, we used to have these wild up and downs. Economy grew a lot faster. We had more frequent recessions, but it was booming, 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 and now it's just kind of going along with the flow. Okay? Exciting? It's exciting. I know it's exciting. Okay? Yes. Okay. So again, expansions and recessions are what's called the business cycle. Okay? This economy grows over time, but it squiggles as it goes up. When it's going up, it's an expansion. When it goes down, it might be a recession. All those bars are the recessions. GDP can go down without it being a recession. Okay? But the up and down, it's a recession. Okay? Expansions and recessions. Recession is an official term. To be a recession, there's a group at the National Bureau for Economic Research that's in charge of recessions. And you're only a recession if they say you are. So a lot of economists, you look at what happened around 2001. Can you find 2001 on this chart? So I don't think that was a recession. I would say that was not a recession. Economy slowed down, but I wouldn't call it a recession. The NBR called it a recession, so it's a recession. Right? Right? Some people, what happens in 80 and 82, the 2 bars that are really close together, some economists say, hey, that's really one long recession. Other economists say, no, it's 2. And the NBER said, nope, 2. And so it's 2. Okay? All right. There are other measures of GDP. For example, there's what we call per capita GDP. And I know you're trying to write stuff down, so I'm taking that away. Per capita. What happens if I decapitate you? It means I cut your head off, right? Per capita is GDP per head. We take the GDP of a country and we divide by the population. So it's GDP per person, which is important because we're producing that much, which means people have to get paid less than what GDP per person is. Okay? So the average income in a country will always be less than what this GDP per capita is. So number 1, GDP per capita is Luxembourg at $113,000 a year. But there's like 5 people that live in Luxembourg, so we don't care. Right? After Luxembourg, we get Switzerland and Norway. Then we get a whole bunch of oil countries stuck in there. Okay, in that top 10. The U.S. is 7 at 65,000. Germany's at 16 at 46,000. Japan is 22. South Korea is 27. And those guys are in the 40s as well. Okay? Yes? In the middle of the world, Russia's at 11.2. Mexico's at 10.1. China's at 10.1. Those guys are right around the global mean, the global average. Warren Buffett says if you're born in the United States, you already won the lottery. The average GDP for the whole world per person is around $11,000. We are, 6 times that. We're way out in what economists would call the tail. Okay? So the average GDP per person in China is 10,000, in the US it's 65,000. I'd rather here than there, right? Now you could say, well, we're better than Germany because 46 and 60. Well, we already talked about reasons why we shouldn't be comparing. So to compare standard of living or the way life is in Russia and Mexico and China, you don't want to do that. You don't want to say, hey, it's about the same. It's not about the same. Those three countries are very different living in those three countries because the GDP doesn't tell you how well off the people are, how happy they are, what's going on. Okay? The bottom of the world, North Korea's $685. If you want to believe in why capitalism, you want to say, somebody says, socialism is better than capitalism. South Korea, $40,000 a year. North Korea, $685 a year. Which do you want to live on? 40,000 or 685? I'm picking the 40. Okay? Just saying. And South Korea's story is not a story of pure beauty and grace and stuff. They had some pretty horrible dictators in there at the beginning, but South Korea, better than North Korea. Burundi, 309, is the bottom of the countries that are listed. This is by the International Monetary Fund. They don't even bother to list Somalia anymore. Things are so bad in Somalia that they don't even bother to list, right? Remember that we live in a world where there's 1.5 billion people who live on $1 a day or less. 1.5 billion people in the world who live on $1 a day or less, right? And somewhere in 2-point-something billion who live on $2 a day or less. You live in the United States. You already won the lottery. Okay? GDP per capita. You can also calculate GDP using something called purchasing power parity. What do we mean by this? Well, a house in China is cheaper than a house in the United States. So even though our income is higher, we have to spend more to get the same stuff. Right? A house in India is way cheaper than a house in the United States. A car in India is cheaper than a car in the United States. So it's cheaper to live in China or India than it is to live in the United States. It's more expensive to live in Japan than it is to live in the United States. So how about we take the GDPs and adjust for the difference in the cost of living in those different countries? Okay? If we do that, that's called purchasing power parity. And it's flawed, right? It's not like it's better than the other way to do GDP. The PPP method of calculating GDP is flawed. And a couple chapters from now, when you start reading your book, you'll come across a thing that shows you kind of how flawed it is. By the standard, U.S. is number 1 GDP in the world, China's number 2, Japan's number 3. If we do PPP, China's number 1, U.S. is number 2, and India's number 3. And that's total GDP, right? That's nominal GDP total, not per capita. That's total GDP. China still has 6 times as many people as we do, with a GDP that's about the same size by PPP. Yeah. Standard GDP, our GDP is still a lot bigger than theirs, with them having 6 times as many people. Okay? Okay. We have other things that do what GDP does, sort of, which are called the National Income and Product Accounts. So GDP is part of this NIPA, the National Income and Product Accounts. It's the gem, the top part of GDP, or of the NIPA, but there's other parts of the NIPA. So if your mom took this class years ago, your mom probably got taught GNP, Gross National Product, not GDP, Gross Domestic Product. Here's the difference. GNP is about your citizens. GDP is about what happens inside your country. So if Wynn Resorts in Las Vegas runs that casino in Macau that they do, some of that, at least some of what happens in that casino would show up in GNP because it's being done by an American company. Okay? Meanwhile, people from other countries are in the United States and they're doing stuff. They don't count in GNP. So which would you rather count? Would you rather count everything that happens inside your country, no matter who does it, So all of the economic activity of non-U.S. citizens in the United States is counted? Or would you rather ignore all the non-U.S. citizens in the United States and count stuff that U.S. people do out of the country? Now, it turns out that these two are never that far apart, so it's kind of a moot point. But most people think that GDP is better because GDP is really telling you what's going on inside your country, which is what you want to know. Okay? But that's GNP. We also have something called national income. So national income is all the income that's created from all of this. So it's the wages and interest and rents and profits and other stuff. It's GDP minus the fact that we use stuff up. So some of the machines that we use to make things get used up. Regular old GDP does not subtract out the stuff we used up to make this stuff. So if we have a machine and it can make 10,000 things a year, and every year you have to get a new machine, the fact that you used up that old machine doesn't change GDP. It changes national income. National income is GDP minus all this stuff that we use up. So it's a better measure of the income of our society. Okay? Then we want to figure out how much income people have. So if we take the income, that the part of GDP which is paid to people, right? Not the part of GDP that's business stuff that goes to, no. Just the part of GDP that goes to people. And then we add into that the government payments that people get. So GDP doesn't have Social Security in it. But we can take GDP, take out the parts that aren't people things, that are business things or government things. We just look at the people part. And then we add into that the money that people get that's not in GDP, which is mostly government payments to people. Okay, Social Security and SNAP payments or whatever kind of payments people are getting. We get this thing called personal income. Now, personal income is cool because we do personal income by states and cities and counties and all kinds of things. And we'll talk about that in a minute. If we take that personal income and we subtract out the taxes that we pay, then we get disposable personal income. So personal income is before tax. Disposable personal income is after tax. Okay? Then we can do per capita. We can do per capita. All right. So what state has the highest personal income per capita? That would be Connecticut. And you're going, Connecticut? Well, yeah. All the rich people in New York who don't live in New York City, where do they live? They live in Connecticut. So poor people don't live in Connecticut, but all these rich New Yorkers live in Connecticut and take the train into work every day. So Connecticut. Massachusetts has high income. New Jersey, which again is people from New York mostly. Then New York. So these are the four states that generate the highest personal income per capita, and they're all tied together, right? They're all in that Northeast New York, right? That's where the money's coming from. And then Maryland, and you're going, Maryland? Well, yeah. A lot of people with a lot of money who work in D.C. live in Maryland. What's the bottom? Kentucky, New Mexico, South Carolina, West Virginia, and Mississippi. So the average personal income per person in Mississippi is about half what it is in Connecticut, Massachusetts, New Jersey. Okay? Yeah? Yeah. So California is 53, Nevada's 42, and Utah is 39. Is that exciting? 15 years ago, Nevada was above California. So again, differences across our country. California's boomed for the last 15 years. Nevada grown, but not boomed so much. And California, instead of being behind Nevada, has pulled away and is well above Nevada now in income. Of course, the cost of living in California is higher too, right? Normal people can't afford a house in California, where you can in Nevada. So there's differences there. In Utah, cheaper cost of living still than Nevada, right? So we have to understand all these things where they come from. Okay. We need to go talk about inflation and unemployment.